Hello, my name's C.L. Barber, and I'm author of the Chronicle Achillean series. The first book is Keeper of the Keystone, and I'm going to be reading from Chapter 7, Retribution. The first chance they had to talk to Dan was in the canteen at break time. Grabbing a seat next to him, Hazel could not contain her excitement. "You'll never guess what happened to Michael last night." "Or what happened on the way to school this morning," added Michael, who, if possible, was even more excited than Hazel. "I heard about Alvin's tumble," Dan grinned, though only by catching the gist of whispering in the corridor. No one's brave enough to mention it too loudly, just in case he or his friends overhear. "Not that, though it's part of it." "Well, what then?" Dan sat in silence, his eyes unblinking. When Michael had finished, a smile spread across his face while his mind worked overtime to explain the events. As the quietest of the trio, Dan contemplated everything thoroughly before commenting. Now, however, he was simply picturing the scene he'd missed earlier, and his dark brown eyes sparkled with pleasure. Stretching his arms above his head, he tensed his muscles. Picked on by boys in his years, it didn't stop some of the girls secretly admiring the toned physique from his enforced tennis lessons. Despite his good looks and athletic build, he wasn't one of the popular kids. In fact, like Michael, he was a bit of an outcast. Alvin and his lapdogs picked on him because of his good manners and his posh voice. For years, Alvin, as posh as a portion of fish and chips, had made it his goal to ensure that everyone regarded Dan as a social outcast. This suited Daniel, who preferred having a couple of close friends to a group of people he hardly knew. It had never bothered him that he wasn't one of the popular kids, for he had never been any good at mixing with others, partly because he was an only child and partly because his parents were always parading him to their work colleagues like a token trophy. That was, of course, when they weren't travelling on work-related business and leaving him in the care of the living nanny. Thinking carefully about the situation, Dan finally responded. "I think we need to keep a diary of everything that's happened so far, so we don't forget anything. It may even help us to work out why these strange things are happening." "What a great idea!" shouted Hazel. "Shh! Keep your voice down," whispered Michael. "We don't want anyone else finding out what's going on." Apologising, Hazel rested her head on her hands thoughtfully. One reason Hazel was so likeable was her enthusiasm for everything. She had an aura about her which brought out the best in them. No matter how depressed or confused he was, Michael could always rely on Hazel to make him smile. Dan complimented this setup by putting problems into perspective and offering sound, sensible advice. Being a year older than the others in her year had alienated her from most students, while only starting halfway through the previous academic year had increased her isolation. Fortunately, both Dan and Michael, knowing how it felt to be an outsider, had offered her their friendship, and ever since then the bond between the three of them had become unbreakable. Hazel had immediately felt at ease with them, because unlike most in their year, they weren't judgmental. They liked her for who she was and hadn't asked any questions about her past or why she was resitting year 10. Rumours had been rife amongst the other students, stories of a teenage pregnancy, and sometime in a detention centre taking the top spots in the fiction category that explained why she was a year behind everybody else. Hazel hadn't bothered to put anyone right. She really didn't care what people thought about her, except for her friends. Michael, he was the third misfit. Unlike Hazel and Dan, who came from financially stable and even wealthy backgrounds, Michael and his mum were poor. Dan was picked on because he was too rich, and Michael because he wasn't wealthy enough. These factors didn't bother them, though. They were best friends and stuck together through thick and thin. The bell rang loudly, signalling the end of break, and Dan and Michael sighed. It was maths next, and no matter how hard they tried, Michael and Dan simply couldn't grasp the main concept of algebra, relying on the mathematical genius of Hazel to get them through. This particularly frustrated Michael, as it was the only subject he was unable to grasp, and he hated the idea of failure. Despite being one of their more pleasant teachers, Mrs. Moss, their maths teacher, was completely incapable of controlling a class of 15-year-olds. Now, he wasn't a person who normally looked to blame others for his failings, but Michael did think this significantly contributed to his lack of ability. After all, how could he concentrate properly on the numbers in front of him while others in the class shouted and yelled like they were at an England football match? Before they had even finished filing into the room, Alvin was already constructing paper aeroplanes to throw at innocent bystanders. These usually hit Miss Moss square on the head, causing howls of laughter for the remainder of the lesson. How she failed to work out the culprit, Michael had no idea. "Can anyone tell me what X is?" Mrs. Moss asked expectantly, whilst most of the class was still unpacking their equipment. "Oi, Mike, see your mum's cleaned you up? Suppose she's got all the right cleaning stuff, you know, what with her job and that," shouted a slobbering Alvin across the length of the classroom. Michael couldn't believe Alvin's audacity, especially after his fall. Typical that no one seemed to remember that part of the morning. Probably too scared to mention it, thought Michael. "You're right, she does have a lot of cleaning equipment. Perhaps she could lend it to you sometime, as it appears you don't possess any," Hazel retaliated to a gobsmacked Alvin. "Please, Hazel, don't aggravate him too much. Last time we ended up in the school pond, and I don't fancy having to explain another incident like that to my parents. They're already threatening me with boarding school," Dan pleaded. Respectfully, Hazel bit her lip. "Don't ever talk to me like that again, yeah?" His threatening tone caused the hushed silence to sweep across the room. Daniel felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Hazel sighed, annoyed that no one else would stand up to him. Okay, so he was big, over 6 foot, and perhaps 14 to 15 stone, which was gigantic compared to most of the students in the year, but that shouldn't mean he could act as he pleased at the expense of others. Mrs. Moss, pretending not to hear, continued discussing algebra with a clearly disinterested class. The only consolation Hazel could find was the thought that his physical enormity was probably a consolation prize for his complete lack of looks, personality, and intelligence. Michael nudged Hazel and winked. "Wish I'd have said that. We'll just have to walk home as fast as possible tonight." Hazel returned his smile, all the while praying the day would end better than it had started. The last thing she wanted was to have to pick herself off the floor twice in one day. As the bell rang, signalling the end of school, and more importantly, the end of the week, Dan, Hazel and Michael scurried like scared mice out of their English classroom, walking towards the school exit twice their normal speed. They hoped to avoid bully boy Alvin. Michael struggled to keep up with Hazel and Dan, as the sole of his shoe kept tripping him up. "Hurry up!" Yet Hazel yelled over her shoulder at a struggling Michael. Trying not to trip over the sole of his left shoe, Michael broke into a jog as he clutched his satchel into his chest, making sure none of his belongings fell out where his zip had broken. Michael and Hazel had decided to change their route home and go through the alley. Dan, who thought an isolated alley was the perfect place to lay in wait to beat someone up, had been outvoted. Hazel's persuasion and Michael's pleading had won the day, and Daniel was starting to think they had been right, as there had been no sign of Alvin yet. "I can't believe we're going to such lengths just to avoid that big oath," Hazel muttered. "Well, let's hope he's forgotten his threat and decided to pick on someone else tonight," said Dan wistfully. "Something tells me your luck's not in," a malicious voice bellowed behind them. All three froze. How had he managed to get there? Surely they would have noticed him on their way home. "Didn't expect to see me, did ya?" A smile spread across Alvin's fat, spotty face, detracting only briefly from his goofy front teeth. Nothing like stating the obvious, is there? Michael thought to himself dismally. However, he refrained from voicing his thoughts, not wanting to aggravate an already dangerous situation. "Oi, Weasel, come and have a looky what I've found," Alvin roared between bursts of laughter, relishing their scared expressions. Out of the dark shadows, Alvin's three cronies emerged. Weasel first, the smallest of the group and aptly named after his sly nature. Everyone knew he was the grass, making inquiries, eavesdropping on unsuspecting conversations, and then feeding his discoveries onto Alvin, the pack leader, who was much too dim to work out anything for himself. Despite being disliked by virtually everyone else, no one dared attack him, for everyone knew he had Alvin's protection. By his look of glee, it was obvious it had been Weasel who had overheard the conversation and informed the others. "Come on, Alv, let's get stuck in," Beef urged. Despite being only a couple of inches smaller than Alvin and almost as obese, Beef seemed awestruck by Alvin and did anything Alvin requested of him. He liked nothing better than attacking and humiliating students against whom Alvin had a personal vendetta, and as Alvin always had a personal vendetta against someone, Beef was constantly kept busy and happy. Animal was the last of the fearsome foursome. His IQ was even lower than Alvin's, and he had an annoying habit of grunting approval every time Alvin made a suggestion. In all the time Michael had known him, too long as far as he was concerned, not once had he heard Animal mutter a proper word. He even seemed incapable of saying yes or no, like most ordinary human beings. Instead, producing a noise rather like a snort through his overlarge, slightly reddish nostrils. "What you waiting for?" Alvin's booming voice echoed through the alley. The four faces edged closer, their eyes twinkling like a child opening his birthday present. Like a pack of wolves, they slobbered as they contemplated their prey. Fearfully, Michael, Dan and Hazel shrank back, turned and raced towards the exit. Their hearts pulsed rapidly as they stumbled forwards, Michael clasping his bag to stop his work falling out, and Daniel swiping his hair out from his eyes. Stumbling over his loose sole, Michael crashed to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Dan and Hazel, having got slightly ahead, heard Michael's yelp, hesitated, then turned to help him, sealing their fate. Gripping an arm each, they hauled him to his feet, all too aware of the lumbering bodies approaching. Quickly wiping himself down, Michael glanced behind him, only to see, not 2 feet away, a towering Alvin, Animal, Beef and Weasel, all grinning wildly. Beef rubbed his hands excitedly as Michael, Dan and Hazel closed their eyes and started to pray. Thank you very much.